I started this show actually initially because I had an experience with an antibiotic-resistant infection, and I'm still here, but I firsthand experienced what it was like to live with a resistant organism. I preface this entire conversation with thank you for devoting your life to trying to help people from things that they don't even know are there. Um, but at this point, I'd just love you to introduce yourself.
Well, thank you for the kindness there. My name is Robert Redfield. I'm an MD. I trained in infectious disease. I spent a little over 20 years at Walter Reed Army Institute of Research, where I was focused on infectious diseases that posed health threats to soldiers, sailors, airmen, and really concentrated on viruses, and particularly the first one was the hepatitis B virus, and then the HIV virus, then the non-A, non-B, now hepatitis C virus, as well as some of the hemorrhagic fever viruses. And when I finished my career after 20 years at Walter Reed, I formed an Institute of Human Virology at the University of Maryland with two colleagues from NIH. And the purpose of that institute was to focus on chronic viruses. So we focused on the HIV virus, the hepatitis B, the hepatitis C, the human papilloma virus. And I built an institute in Baltimore to do that. And then in 2018, President Trump asked me if I would go to CDC and run CDC. And so my wife and I moved to Atlanta, and I took the helm at CDC from 2018 to 2021. Afterwards, I came back to be the senior public health advisor for the state of Maryland and Governor Hogan. And then I started my own consultancy business, as well as going back to practicing clinical medicine 2 days a week, which I'm at right now. I just finished my clinic, and I focused largely on long COVID and the complications of vaccine injury from the COVID vaccines.
You were there in that crazy period at the beginning of 2020 when the rest of us were staring at the TV, terrified, had absolutely no idea what was going on. We had Dustin Hoffman and the Outbreak movie in our head, as what was potentially coming for us, and, you know, desperately looking for some kind of a compass to guide us at that point. And I remember seeing your face very frequently during that time. So I know you spent a lot of time talking to the public. But COVID also created some really unusual behaviors among people. And my background is a little unusual. So I actually started in sociology. I'm a self-taught, chemist, started a biotech company, out of necessity, built it into, what it is now. But the fascination into human behavior has never left. I remember wondering why the way you vote started determining your health-related behavior. Why does I'm a Republican, therefore I'm not going to wear a mask? I'm a Democrat, therefore I'm going to get a vaccine. It makes about as much sense as I was born at Cedars-Sinai and therefore I like pasta. Why do you think that happened during COVID? Why do you think people started politicizing health?
I don't know, but it is true what you point out. Unfortunately, it did become very, very politicized. When the pandemic started, I was of the view that we ought to have a national program. And obviously, as the CDC director, I thought maybe I should have one of the leadership voices in that. It was decided by the administration that we wouldn't do that, that we would let each governor develop their own perspective on how to handle the pandemic in their own states. And as a consequence, we had multiple different points of view. As you point out, certain trends evolved. I think you would easily say that one of the problems with the COVID response, looking backwards, was there was enormous government overreach on a number of issues. And I do think a lot of the pushback that took political sides had to do with that government overreach. Mandating vaccines. This vaccines for COVID should have never been mandated. Once they were mandated, you had people that were pro-mandate and anti-mandate. Same thing happened when it came down to issues like you mentioned, masking. Certain areas mandated masking, certain areas didn't mandate masking. I think it had more to do with the instincts of the individual towards whether the government was going to tell them what to do or not. But it was a problem. There's no doubt about that, it was a problem, and we're paying a big price for it now because a lot of people in our nation no longer look to these traditional public health institutes as a source of knowledge, as a source of recommendations. There's been a lot of loss of public trust and public confidence in our public health agencies, whether it's CDC, where I was, or NIH or FDA. And I think a lot of that was consequence, unfortunately, of the government overreach that happened during the COVID pandemic. Schools should have never been closed. The economy should have never been shut down. Vaccines should have never been mandated. But unfortunately, there were some individuals that believed they knew the best way for you to protect yourself. And whether you understood it or not, they were going to mandate it. So that's what you did. But it is, you are right. I mean, you can tell people how they vote basically on what decisions they made related to COVID and their own health.
It was absolutely fascinating to me and sociologically, crazy that people were making those decisions. The other thing I noticed, and as a consequence of losing that sort of North Star, that compass, or starting to lose trust in the health authorities, I think we saw a rise in less qualified people giving health advice online, this whole new influencer health culture. And it's almost like, what did you have access to next? Okay, so if you're not believing what you're seeing on the news on TV and you've got your phone in your hand, the next thing down is probably going to be social media. And all of a sudden we have the home-taught epidemiologists of the world that are saying, don't do this, don't do that. And I also noticed that whereas it used to be how many citations you have on your CV, how many papers you've published, how much background you have, all of a sudden it became how many followers you had that was affecting your health-related decisions. Reality stars became, overnight geopolitical experts and, infectious disease experts. And I think that we're still facing that kind of an issue where until we level up again and bring the health authorities back to the point at which we can trust them, we're going to be seeing a lot of disparate advice. And unfortunately, if there's another pandemic, it's going to be a little bit of which influencer do you trust the most at the moment.
Yeah, I think that's important. I mean, that's part of my book called Redfield's Warning. One of the warnings is just that, is we're not prepared for the next pandemic. And part of that, we're even less prepared for the next than we were for COVID, because what happened between COVID and now is we have lost that credibility of these public health experts. And you are right that these social media influencers end up having as much, if not more, credibility than the director of CDC or the head of NIH, just because society has given them that credibility. And unfortunately, because during the COVID pandemic, some of our public health leaders ended up creating an environment where those institutions lost their credibility.
So looking back, do you think that the single biggest overreach was the vaccine mandate? Was that the moment that you feel like it may have gone too far?
Yeah, there's no doubt about it. The vaccine mandate was over the top because, the COVID vaccine, which I was part of developing with Operation Warp Speed, the COVID vaccine never prevented infection. So that when Biden and Fauci said to have your children vaccinated so they don't infect grandma, that wasn't a true statement, because there was no evidence that being vaccinated would influence your transmissibility to somebody else or the acquisition. There was an a priori decision made by certain people in that group, Tony being one of them, that the American public needed to be vaccinated, whether they wanted to or not. And there was this incorrect view that there was this concept that we call herd immunity. And when a certain percentage of the American public was immune, either from infection or vaccine or both, that the pandemic would stop. And originally, Fauci had suggested it was 30%, along with some other individuals that vocalized that opinion. And then later they modified it to 50%. And then later they modified it to 70%. I happen to be a virologist, and I happen to tell the president and other people that I didn't believe herd immunity was operational for COVID. I had seen plenty of patients that had COVID only for 3 months later to get COVID again. So natural infection was not protecting against reinfection. I remember when Fauci finally told people it was 70% that we had to reach for epidemic to end and herd immunity to take effect. People believed in herd immunity, and Tony had purported that 50% we'd have herd immunity, which meant the pandemic would stop. And then shortly thereafter revised it and said 70%. And a reporter said to Dr. Fauci, said, recently you said 50%, but now you're saying 70%. Can you tell us the new data that you have that made you revise your opinion from 50% to 70%? And, I always used to tell Tony the simplest answer to the American public was to tell them the truth. And if you don't know the answer, tell them I don't know the answer. Well, Tony turned to the reporter and said, there is no new data. But when I told you 50%, I told you that because I didn't think you were ready to hear 70%. In other words, same thing when CDC stopped tracking patients that were vaccinated, they got infected. Because if patients got infected that were already vaccinated, some people thought that negated the value of the vaccine. So rather than just tell people, some people get infected when they're vaccinated because the vaccine doesn't protect against infection. What CDC did was stop tracking the number of people that were vaccinated that got infected. So there was a big a push to make vaccines look as they were the answer. The same problem came if you brought up the idea of vaccine injury or vaccine side effects. Those things were not really discussed. And then that, of course, led to the view that we were going to mandate vaccines for all kids in school and kids in college, mandate vaccines if you want to go on an airplane, mandate vaccines for health workers, mandate vaccines for the military. This was a big mistake. And if the COVID vaccine really did block infection 100%, we could have an argument about whether one would consider mandating the vaccine. But I think the answer is to give the American public the information and let them make the best decision for their own health, rather than for Big Brother to tell them what decision they should make. And this is where we lost a lot of credibility.
Did anybody really have any certainty at that point what was going to happen? I mean, what was it like there in the beginning?
In the first week or so in February, we recognized the new pandemic in China around New Year's Eve, and we started to see diagnosis cases in America. I think my first case was probably diagnosed in January 20, 21st, 22nd. In early February, I had CDC brief me on what they anticipated the mortality would be in the United States. So they had all these different types of models and smart people, and they came in and briefed me and said by September of 2020, we'll have 2,200,000 Americans will have died from COVID.
Wow, that's a big number.
It's a big number. At the time, we probably, of the briefing, I don't think we had any deaths. We had maybe, you know, 10 or 12 infections in the United States. And they're telling me that in the next 8 months, I'm going to lose 2.2 million Americans. That's a lot. If you look at the Vietnam War, we lost, 57,000 people from 56 to 73. And now we're going to lose 2.2 million. We did end up losing, unfortunately, about 1.2 million. I'm not saying we take credit for saving that other million, but I do think, our response did have some positive benefit, but you could argue that it was still a catastrophic loss of human life. Biosecurity is really one of the greatest national security threats our nation has, and we're at high risk for another pandemic, which is going to be, I call the COVID pandemic the lesser pandemic. The next pandemic is going to be the great pandemic. It's going to be a bird flu pandemic. It's going to be catastrophic. So at the beginning, it was trying to figure out anybody can make the right recommendations with all the answers. We didn't have all the answers. We were trying to gather information and make the best decisions. The first problem was what happened was George Gao, who was the head of CDC, in China, and I had a number of conversations at New Year's Eve and the first couple days of January of the new year. And George basically told me that he was confident there was no human to human transmission. And he was confident that there was no asymptomatic infection. So this was like SARS and MERS. If you got infected, you got sick. And if you got sick, you didn't really transmit it that well to human. Well, I was suspicious because in the first 27 cases, there were three clusters in families. And I didn't think that it was likely that the three members of the family all went by the same wet market space to get infected. Maybe one got infected and then came home and infected the other two. But I was assured there was no human to human transmission. Now, towards the end of the month of January, we had diagnosed in the United States in the first couple of weeks of February, I had diagnosed 14 people across the US that had this new COVID-19 virus. And of those 14 people, we identified 800 contacts about. And we evaluated those 800 contacts, and only two were infected. Now, we said, okay, this virus is like SARS and MERS. It's not very transmissible among humans. But how did we diagnose those two infected people? We asked them if they were sick or not, because George said there was no asymptomatic infection in China, which unfortunately wasn't true, we later learned. But if they were asymptomatic and not sick, we didn't test them. We only tested the people that were sick. If we tested the people, all 800 contacts, I guarantee you we would have found there were a lot of people infected that had no symptoms. Because about 2 weeks later, this ship called the Diamond Princess was docking in Japan, and they had COVID on it. And they did invite CDC to come in and help them evaluate it. And when we got on that ship, we found out that over half the people on the ship uh, were infected, and most of them were asymptomatic. So we knew asymptomatic infection was the rule, not the exception. So it meant our whole approach of identifying sick people and working around them was flawed. And then we had to move to an approach of using testing to diagnose people and then move around people that tested positive. And we weren't really prepared to do that. So those were some of the early mistakes that were made from the public policy perspective. Another huge mistake was this decision that we needed to shut down schools or shut down our economy or shut down our medical screenings or shut down our churches. These were highly misguided policies that really weren't based on data, they were based on emotion.
People seem to forget that the single job of a virus is to hide and survive. That is its, role in life. Can it survive? Can it infect more people? Can it stay under the radar? So I remember thinking COVID must be a very brilliant organism. I mean, this thing is highly transmissible. It can hang out in people and be carried around. And was there anything that gave you, I'll call it a nudge toward believing that it was engineered instead of a natural phenomenon?
Yes, I felt very early on in January that this was an engineered virus. And first, because unfortunately, the scientific community decided to say this was SARS like and MERS like. Well, this virus is nothing like SARS or MERS. When SARS came into the population 2002, 2003, it went from a bat to a civet cat to humans. And when you looked at the humans that were infected, it never really learned how to go human to human. So as you and I sit here today, more than 20 years later, there's less than 10,000 cases in the world. And the original SARS outbreak, you probably know this, there was less than 1,500 cases in the world. And MERS was not that different, came in 2012, 2013. It went from a bat to a camel to humans, but it never really learned how to go human to human. And very few humans were ultimately infected, even to this day. So it was a highly infectious virus from man going human to human, which was very different than say SARS or MERS. And so, in looking at the literature, one of the things I found out, it was in the public domain, but a lot of people didn't look at it. In 2014, the laboratory in Wuhan, which was implicated, as potentially being an alternative source of the virus besides the wet market, that laboratory published a paper that they had succeeded in teaching the coronavirus how to infect human tissue. And so I was of the point of view that since this laboratory was working on gain of function research and trying intentionally to teach coronaviruses how to infect humans, when I talked to George Gow about the wet market, George told me they had 27 cases and they all came from the wet market. So I asked George what his case definition was, and he said it's the people that have a respiratory illness, it's not flu and it's not SARS, that came from the wet market. I said, well, George, then by definition, everybody came from the wet market. Why are you trying to put the attention on the wet market? And I said, you need to go outside the wet market and look. And so he did. And a couple of days later, he called me back and he said, Bob, we have hundreds and hundreds of cases in Wuhan. It has nothing to do with the wet market. The wet market was a ruse to take the attention away from the laboratory. The laboratory meant that this pandemic was not an act of nature. And this is where Fauci and others and Collins got very angry at me, was I was saying, it was a consequence of science. And now we're all paying the price.
So gain of function research. So I only learned about this recently, but you know, natural microbial evolution is a relatively quick process. I mean, I talked about on our AMR episode the fact that in every human generation there can be hundreds of thousands of bacterial generations, for example. So gain of function research is intended to essentially, I mean, they call it GOF research. I almost want to call it playing God research. They're trying to give Mother Nature a hand and speed up evolution and teach these microbes, in this case viruses, how to do things that they wouldn't ordinarily evolve to do in that short period of time. Is that correct?
It's the type of research that is trying to lead the pathogen to do what they want to do. So in this case, in gain of function for COVID, the first thing they wanted the pathogen to do was learn how to attach to the human epithelium, okay, and so it could replicate in humans. And so what they did was they took the virus and they inserted a cleavage site, which I call the furin cleavage site, which when I briefed Pompeo, used to be classified, it's been declassified now, and he asked me to interpret what the data they had from their intelligence. I said that furin cleavage site, Mr. Secretary, is the smoking gun. That furin cleavage site does not belong in the COVID virus. And what it did, you have to understand what it did. The furin cleavage site changed the orientation of the COVID virus binding domain so that from it used to recognize the binding site on the bat cell, but by changing the orientation, it no longer recognized the bat cell receptor, but now it recognized the human receptor. So now this virus could bind to the human cell, which is a prerequisite of it infecting it. The other thing people choose to overlook is that when you have a furin cleavage site, which is just basically 12 nucleotides, then those nucleotides code for 4 amino acids. And each amino acid is coded by 3 nucleotides. Now, the amino acid arginine has several different triplets that can code for arginine. The triplets that are in the COVID virus, the triplets they have for arginine are the preferred triplets that the human uses for arginine, not the preferred triplet that the bat uses for arginine. So, how did a human arginine triplet get into a bat virus? Then you ask the question, what's the consequence of the furin cleavage site? And the consequence of the furin cleavage site is if you take a virus with the furin cleavage site in it, this bat virus, and this is where I argued with Tony, if you take that bat virus now, it no longer can efficiently infect bats. It can only efficiently infect humans. And then there's some other things about the virus that's pretty into the weeds. They knocked out the interferon response element, which meant when you got this virus, you didn't get sick.
Yep. So it could be transmitted easier.
It's asymptomatic. All right. And then they knocked out some of the immune dominant domains so that when you do get infected with this virus, all right, you don't develop an immune response that's durable to keep you from not getting reinfected with it. So it's a highly manipulated virus. There's no doubt in my mind that it was created in the laboratory, a consequence of gain of function research that was actually conducted in China in the Wuhan lab, but it was funded by the United States. So, when people want to just dump on China, the United States funded this research, and several US investigators were involved in the research. And, certain scientists have, attacked me and others suggesting it came from the laboratory because they're trying to protect gain of function research. Certain people like Fauci and certain scientists believe the goal is to learn how pathogens become more pathogenic for humans so that we'll be prepared when they do become more pathogenic for humans. And so, in other words, we create the pathogens to be prepared to confront it. I don't agree with that logic, but that was their logic. The other logic is, and this is something Justice Scalia, when he was on a panel that I had asked him to be on in Italy in a committee, a meeting that I chaired, I had a session on what does science expect of society, and then I had an afternoon on what does society expect of science. Justice Scalia was insightful to the scientists. Is the problem with you scientists is you ask the question, but you never ask, should you ask the question? In other words, so, and that's how science is. Some people believe every question needs to be asked. They never try to reflect on should it be asked. So this virus was definitely created as a consequence. Now, why were the Chinese doing this work? I don't know this. I speculate that this was a dual use military civilian lab. I think that they were working on a defensive, what I call a vaccine vector program, which they were hoping they could make so they could vaccinate the Chinese military and the Chinese people and maybe the world in general against a variety of different pathogens. And what they wanted to do is have a vaccine vector, a viral vector that they could use. And for that vector to be useful, first it had to be spread by aerosol so we could vaccinate people quickly. You don't need needles. We ran out of needles all the time. Second thing, it had to not make people sick, i.e., the interferon response element. Third thing, you didn't want people who got it not to be able to get it again when you decide to give a different antigen in the vaccine. So you didn't want immunodominant responses that would prevent people from getting infected with this new vaccine. Hence, they put in the way to block an immune response dominant response. But I think that they were trying to make a universal vaccine vector. Unfortunately, they didn't to give enough credibility to the fact that these respiratory viruses are very difficult to contain, and obviously it escaped. And it was not recognized probably when it escaped originally because most of the people working in the laboratory were young, and young people didn't get sick. And we now know, it's been declassified. We now know that in September, a number of people in that laboratory got sick with an illness that, in retrospect, looks like it was COVID.
My daughter was 6 at the time. We were stuck in, lockdown ground zero in Los Angeles, and I no longer lived there, and we left during COVID, and I didn't like how it was handled there, obviously. But she was out of school for 2.5 years. I remember taking her to get her school pictures taken, and they, temperature monitored her forehead getting out of the car. They made her walk through these cones, to get into the school gym, one by one, hundreds of feet away from people. And I remember looking at her and saying, all I feel like I can say is I'm sorry. Like, this is not how your childhood is supposed to feel.
It was a big mistake. I said, publicly at the time as CDC director that the public health interest of K through 12 was best served by keeping kids in face-to-face learning. I argued that taking them out of face-to-face learning was going to have very negative public health consequences. I got a big award in Baltimore from the Archdiocese of Baltimore because I worked with them to keep their schools open, and they kept their schools open, even though they were threatened by the public health community for doing so. And I'm an aggressive person. I said when Governor Hogan, when this was going on, I called the governor and said, if Howard County Health Department wants to try to block the Catholic schools from staying open, get ready for a lawsuit because I'm going to help them with a lawsuit for the separation of church and state for the freedom of religion to practice the way they want to. And that was on a Friday, and on Monday they both withdrew their objections, and the school stayed open. When they got their testing scores for the testing to see how they were doing 2 years afterwards, that the highest scores they've ever had in math and English, and the public schools had the lowest scores they've ever had. So the loss was huge for children that have autism, like your child. It was catastrophic. I had plenty of families that were in special ed whose children were finally making progress. They finally were able to communicate a little with their parents. The parents were happy. They're seeing some progress. And then all of that stopped. And I argue, a lot of the kids in school who got knocked off their learning curve never got back on it. And a lot of the kids that were in special ed never got back to the state that they were before the pandemic. So huge, huge, not to mention the isolation, the mental illness, the suicide, the loss of learning. It was a catastrophic policy decision not to keep the schools open.
I have a number of alarmist doctors as friends and family members, it turns out. And at the same time, we also had no idea what the heck was going on, just like the rest of the American public. She's just found out she's pregnant. We're isolated inside. This could be either, the greatest threat to mankind anybody's ever seen, or it could be a cold at that point. He spent the first 12 months or so of his life, I don't think he saw more than 3 or 4 people from outside the house. Maybe met 1 or 2 other kids his age, but of course they had to keep their distance. And he was a late speaker, and we just sort of wrote it off at the time. Well, he didn't imprint properly, because everybody was wearing face coverings at the time. He doesn't understand how people communicate. But yeah, he wasn't the only one. I have met so many people whose kids started communicating so much later because they didn't realize that you use your mouths to communicate. They were just covered the whole time.
It was all unnecessary. And then this whole view, even if they did go to school masking them, it was really a tragedy. When I worked, I tried to say on many times, I tried to ask the teachers, they had a very important vocation. I said I was proud of the nurses and doctors that went and took care of the sick people because they had a vocation. And I said, you teachers also have a vocation, and you need to step up and exercise your vocation. And the woman who was in charge of the teachers union, Gardner, she was terrible. Well, we're not going to do this until we all get vaccinated. And of course, in shutting down the economy was, I happened to be in the camp of Mike Pence, where we wanted 15 days to take a knee and to examine different activities and try to determine how do you continue those activities in a safe and responsible way, as opposed to just shutting everything down. And then you look in the medical community, which should have known better. They stopped, their colonoscopies, their mammograms, their breast screening. We had a huge increase in serious cancer after the pandemic because of the loss of all the preventive measures that we did. Then all the people that died alone in hospitals because people didn't visit them. Hospitals didn't let them be visited. I was asked to give a talk for Pope Francis in August of 2023, which I did for the Vatican for a series of political leaders, prime ministers and parliamentarians, congressmen, senators, and they have around 200 to 300 of them that gather every year to talk about different issues. And I was asked to give a talk, and my talk was entitled Science, Medicine, Pandemics, and the Catholic Faith. And I was very aggressive in criticizing the Catholic Church, the Pope, for canceling the sacraments. And I happen to be Catholic, and I believe our Lord's in the Blessed Sacrament. I said, I had 11 grandkids at the time. I have 14 now. I said, none of them believe our Lord's in the Blessed Sacrament, because if he was in the Blessed Sacrament, you wouldn't have canceled it. And then I went back and showed how the Catholic Church responded in the 1300s to the plague. I said, they increased the sacraments. They took care of the sick. They visited the sick. And what did you do with COVID? In the Catholic hospitals, you didn't visit the sick. You shut it down. You stopped having mass, you stopped having the sacraments, you didn't let people go to church. I said, "These were big mistakes." And I said, "I'm not saying this to be critical, because that's not my role. I'm saying this so you don't make the same mistake when the next pandemic comes, because the great pandemic is coming." It goes back to my book about Redfield's warning. The next pandemic is coming, and it's gonna be potentially catastrophic if we don't get better prepared. And now we're at a bigger disadvantage because we've lost one of the most important elements of our response, which is to have public health institutions that are trusted. We don't have them anymore.
What are the ripple effects that you can see as an expert who, observes infectious disease in the population right now?
Well, I think you can see it that there's a rise in vaccine hesitancy. There's a rise in hesitancy towards medical interventions in general. Um, there's a rise in equating the value of a recommendation, particularly related to public health, as you pointed out earlier. The influencer from nowhere, Arkansas, has as much credibility as the Secretary of Health.
The next pandemic, we can all come to the conclusion now we weren't very well prepared for the last one. We all lived through it. I occasionally change the letters BC in terms of the date, like 1000 BC, 500 BC to before COVID, is the new BC for me.
I've thought about the same thing, doing before COVID and after COVID.
So we weren't prepared then. And now in your book, you say we're even less prepared now for what is likely to be a far worse organism that goes after the population. So can you talk about that a little?
Yeah, I think that's one of the main thrusts of the book is that I'm still hopeful. I'm an optimist that when more people become aware of the threat, that we will come together and get prepared. So I argue that biosecurity is one of our nation's greatest national security threats. I actually think biosecurity is a greater threat than Russia or China, Iran, or North Korea. I think the potential of biological agents, whether they become in nature or they become because of a scientific accident or gain of function research or intentional bioterrorism, they're actually more destructive than nuclear weaponry. And we need to get prepared. Now, what we've done for the traditional threats in defense is we build a defense department and we've built a network of private sector contractors to meet our defense needs, or airplanes, or missiles, or subs, or bullets, et cetera, et cetera. I argue that we need to do the same for our global health security needs. And so we need to invest heavily in antiviral drug development so that we have multiple drugs that are available that we can take that can modify the negative impact of these diseases. Right now, bird flu, which is the greatest threat, if you look at the bird flu cases in Southeast Asia that have occurred in the last 20 years, they carry about a 40 to 50% mortality. It's a bad disease, okay? Now, um, the current bird flu in humans that's coming from the chickens and turkeys isn't there. We've had one death, about 100 infections. But the reality is these pathogens have great potential to cause significant human mortality. And we ought to have antivirals that work that can modify that and treat that. And we really ought to aggressively be investing in that. I also think we need to invest in diagnostics. I think we should invest in vaccines. Although I don't believe vaccines are the answer, I think we had one of the most successful vaccines programs in the history of the world with Operation Warp Speed and building the COVID vaccines. But we now know that we've still lost over 1 million people. So they're not the answer to stopping the morbidity that is coming. I mean, they may play a role, and we can talk about that, but the real answer is antiviral drug development, and that's what we need to do. We also have to, develop countermeasures that can use to interrupt transmission. We have to, as you know, you worked in this space, we have to develop medical equipment that we can anticipate we would need. For example, it's predictable that we're going to need ventilatory support. When COVID came, you may or may not remember this, Mike Pence, who was a vice president, took a trip up to Ford in Michigan. And the reason he went up there was he asked Ford if they'd shut down the car lines and turn them over to make ventilators because we didn't have the ventilators we needed to support the pandemic. Okay. So these things should be done ahead of time. So I've proposed that we try to build a biosecurity uh, program, and we put it in the energy department because they're used to weapons of mass destruction, and they have 6 really good labs, and they could manage the extramural contracts with the private sector because largely this is not going to be an expansion of public stuff. It's going to be an expansion of the private sector so that we can have manufacturing of antiviral drugs, diagnostics, vaccines, which the public will benefit from long term, just similar to how we benefited from the space program and all the things we developed for the space program, which now we benefit from in telephones, computers, and communication, etc. So we need to be doing that now over the next 3 to 4, 5 years, not in the midst of the pandemic. When I was a CDC director, we had to make these decisions in the midst of the epidemic. Now, there was a lot of question, as I said, even in January. On January 31st, I asked the president to shut down all air travel to and from China. And at that time, we probably had less than a dozen cases in the United States and no deaths. And some people said, "Well, what are you talking about? There's less than a dozen cases and there's no deaths." I said, "No, no, no, this is gonna be a big problem. My people have, predicted we're gonna have over 1,000,000 deaths. And we need to try to slow the spread of this virus. We're not gonna be able to stop it, but we need to try to slow the spread while we try to develop the countermeasures we need." And to the president's credit, he listened to my argument. He had certain people disagree with me, like the Secretary of Treasury, et cetera. And he then turned to the Secretary of Treasury and said that we can rebuild our economy, but we can't rebuild these lives that are lost. So if the Redfield thinks we need to do this, he turned to his chief of staff. He said, "We're doing this." And so we shut down air travel to and from China. And then in March, I came back and told him now we have to shut down air travel to and from Europe. And we did that. These were big steps. So when people think the president didn't take this seriously, no, he took it very seriously. I mean, these were big steps. Now, maybe he didn't communicate as well as he could to the American public because he wanted to not get them nervous. He didn't maybe hit the both tones as well as he could have. But when people tell me he didn't take the COVID pandemic seriously, I absolutely disagree with that. He took it very seriously.
You talked about building a less fragmented, health system for future responses. Putting it inside of the energy department. So right now, is that the first step you would take to rebuild the public trust? Is to essentially marry all of the different agencies? Make sure that they were communicating with the same messaging.
I happen to have a lot of confidence in Secretary Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy. I think he gets a raw deal. I don't think the press supports him the way they should. The reason we lost so many people in COVID is we're a sick nation. We have over half of our people in America have a chronic disease. Over 20% of kids in adolescents are obese. We got a problem. Over 20% had 30% have diabetes before they're 30 years old. We got a problem. And he's got some pretty good ideas how to begin to confront that problem. And he's put a good team together, between Jay Bhattacharya and Marty McCary and Dr. Oz. But I'm not sure how open, as you pointed out before, I'm not sure how open both sides are to listening to these really good people as they try to move health in the right direction because we've become so polarized. I do think it would be useful for Congress to embrace the fact that biosecurity is a threat. And, one of the first things they could do is do a critical review, deep dive of the decisions that were made during COVID. not to try to accuse people one way or the other, but just what decisions did we make? In retrospect, were they the right decisions or were they the wrong decisions? How did we make them? One of the biggest problems with the COVID decisions is there was no debate. If you disagreed with the main people, in this case, largely Fauci, if you disagreed with that point of view, you were canceled. When I suggested on CNN that this virus came from a Chinese laboratory, not from nature, that Tony had suggested, the next day I had articles, the front page of the Baltimore Sun, saying I was an Asian racist.
You were just suggesting we explore the possibility. You weren't even accusing them of malice, were you?
No, no. And I think actually, if you think about it, the other side was saying the virus came from a wet market because the way the Chinese eat meat and get their food, that might be more racist than saying it came from the laboratory. But no, I was ostracized. I was beaten up. It wasn't pleasant. I have some very famous scientists that wrote me letters saying the best thing that I could do for the world is take my own life because I was so out of touch to suggest this virus actually came from science. How could I say that? I do think if we could have an honest, open discussion of the good things and the not so good things that were decisions that were made during COVID, that would be a great first start. Second thing, I think Congress realizing, as they've realized that cybersecurity is an issue, if they could realize that biosecurity is an issue and begin to fund the development of a program to prepare ourselves and ground that in, say, the Department of Energy, maybe started out with, $100 million or, ultimately, I think it's going to be, several $100 billion a year that we'd have to build, but just to start to lay the foundation for the program. Um, Obviously strengthening if we can or rebuild the credibility of our public health institutions. I think that's going to be hard. I mean, my own organization, CDC, is in a lot of trouble right now. I mean, they don't have a leader. Um, they're having their mission cannibalized. You have the State Department trying to take over the global health mission. You have the Defense Department trying to take over the domestic response mission. It's a problem, but I do think leadership matters. Seeing the possible and articulate it can really make a difference. I'm always reminded of Kennedy's uncle, John Kennedy, when he was president, 1962. I think it was in October. He said, we're going to put a man on the moon before the end of the decade. I can guarantee you when he said that, he had no idea scientifically how we were going to pull that off. Okay. And yet he said we were going to do it and he led a nation to act. And in 1969, we put a man on the moon. Well, the same thing is here with rebuilding health in America, making America a healthiest nation, transforming our disease system, which we have, into a health system. And I would argue, building a solid foundation so that we're prepared for the biosecurity threats of the future. And, the most important component of that preparation is to do the innovative science so that we have antivirals that are there that the human body can take that can defend us against any of these potential pathogens as they come along. You can argue the backup threat is what you've experienced, and I've always said the backup threat is antimicrobial resistance. That's a biosecurity threat too.
And I often say that if somebody dropped a bucket of an airborne bacteria on a subway train, we'd have an immediate antibiotic for it, at warp speed, no pun intended. Unfortunately, we don't have them in advance.
We should have them in advance. We need to invest in innovation. I think it's important that we have sort of an honest, critical review, a non-defensive review of what we got right and what we got wrong. Listen, I was in there, I was the head of CDC. I'm not afraid. I told you we made a big mistake by focusing that this was a symptomatic, poorly transmissible pathogen. No, it was asymptomatic and it was highly transmissible. All right. So I am trying to agitate so that hopefully our congressional leaders and our political leaders will wake up and see that we need to develop a comprehensive program for the security threats that are created by biology. Senator Alexander and Senator Blunt were good friends of mine when I was CDC director, and I remember talking to both of them because I was trying to generate some support and during the COVID pandemic for this kind of concept that I just laid out to you. And they both told me that as soon as COVID seems to be under control, the interest for this will disappear. Not that they weren't interested, they were thoughtful. So, part of what I have conceded my own self to is there's a good possibility I won't succeed, even though I'm trying with my book, and that we won't recognize the importance of what I want done until the pandemic starts.
You know what I love about what RFK Jr. did? I like that he agitated, to use a word that you just used. He got the conversation started, and why things like childhood obesity is bad is somehow political is beyond me.
He showed his true commitment to the mission. Okay. It wasn't an easy thing for Kennedy in his background to align himself with President Trump. This was a path for him to make America healthy again. And Trump, to his credit, said, Kennedy, I see your passion. I think you're a highly effective guy. I think you believe that this is doable. You see the possible. Uh, I'd love to have you on the team and start running. You get running. Let's make America healthy again. And Kennedy is not anti-vaccine. He just wants honesty about vaccines. If I say to somebody, let's talk about the side effects of this vaccine, they jump and said, oh, you're anti-vaccine. I said, no, I'm not anti-vaccine. I just want to talk about the side effects. Oh, no, no, no. You must be anti-vaccine if you want to talk about the side effects. Or I want to see the data that shows the efficacy of this vaccine. Oh, you must be anti-vaccine. No, I'm not anti-vaccine. Just show me the data that shows it works. And Kennedy is just asking for honesty on the vaccine debate. And when you look back at the CDC group, the ACIP that he let go, which I don't disagree, a lot of people don't know the reality is Biden put 13 of the 17 members on that panel for a 4-year term in the last year, some of them even after the election, after he lost. And then he extended one other person for 4 more years. So 14 of the 17 members, Kennedy was going to have no say on during his entire run as Secretary of Health. I think Kennedy's going to help start transforming our nation to building a health system. You're right, he's an agitator, he's a disruptor, but he's an agitator and disruptor and has pretty good ideas of how to replace it with something that actually works.
I also just don't have a problem with anybody who wants children to be healthier. Like, that is not anything but a noble goal, no matter which side you're on. So, my wish is that, of course, people could start conversing. We've lost the ability to disagree respectfully in this country. Obviously, you've experienced that. Um, and I'm happy that we're conversing, though, at least at this point. And on the health side, I think that's at least what RFK Jr. Got started. He got the conversation started again.
To Kennedy's credit, he's already met with these guys, the highly processed foods. He's really making progress in getting companies to take, the processing out. Now, the way he did this is he got a lot of people across the country through Make America Healthy Again and all these housewives that are now listening to Kennedy and they're saying, I'm not going to buy that. I'm not going to buy that. I'm not going to buy that. And so finally the industry is listening and they're starting to change processing. He's gotten the dyes that we feel that aren't allowed in most other countries of the world. He's gotten those dyes out of our food. He's going to continue to make progress. And I think he'll show an impact on obesity within the 2 years that he promised the president. I think he'll get that done. It won't be over, but he'll show we're moving in the right direction. We turned the corner. And he's going to make a big impact, I think, on drug use disorder, which is important to me. I like Kennedy because he knows the stigma is the enemy of public health. He's not afraid to tell people that he used to use heroin. I know when I talked about my son who almost died of a fentanyl overdose because of contaminated cocaine, the Secretary of Health called me the next morning around 6:30 in the morning, and he said, "Boy, you have courage." I said, "Mr. Secretary, what do you mean you have courage? I mean, you admitted publicly that your son used drugs." I said, "I'm not ashamed of my son." I said, "My son has a medical problem and we need to get him treated for it." The problem is that, Mr. Secretary, stigma is the enemy of public health. All right. I don't need to stigmatize people. I don't like the word addict. I think it's a stigmatizing term. And a lot of these kids who use drugs use them to self medicate because they're not getting the mental health services they need. Kennedy will take that on. And he'll take it on probably more effectively than any secretary has ever taken. And then, of course, he's going to go after the other chronic diseases that we have, as you mentioned, diabetes and hypertension, congestive heart failure, reactive airway disease. I think it's really great that he's focusing on chronic disease and he'll make an impact. He'll make an impact. I just wish the media and those that are been against him would, as you point out, just help him succeed. He's just trying to make your family healthier. Why don't you help him succeed?
I firmly believe that because of Kennedy's Maha movement, that the 30s to 40s females, young mothers, for example, are going to be the most important voting population. And we owe that to him.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think that's what he did for the last election too. He got the suburban housewives to come on board to help Trump win the election. And it's only going to get stronger and stronger and stronger and stronger. And as he starts getting results, it's going to get stronger and stronger and stronger. But I want to come back to what you said. Well, how can you be against making children healthy? How can you be against trying to make you and your family healthy? All right. So I've always been one, independent of who wins, I always want the president to be successful. When I got criticized because I decided to be CDC director in the Trump administration, and when I left, I had a number of groups that wouldn't hire me as a consultant because they said, "You work for Trump." And I said, "No, I worked for the American people. That's who I worked for, the American people." I mean, I don't apologize. I like Trump. I worked with him. We had an effective relationship. But the truth is, I work for the American people. All right. And the fact is, Kennedy is trying to make your family healthy again. And yet, the media and a lot of people, including all those CDC directors that wrote that op-ed against him, are trying to help him fail. Why would you do that?
Going back to your book, the recommendations you're making, do you feel like this administration is more likely to listen?
I'm hopeful. I'm an optimist. I think it's much more likely than the last administration. And when you come to autism, I mean, the Kennedy's committed to it. Jay Bhattacharya is committed to it. I mean, Jay's going to, launch an NIH, a significant amount of money at NIH to look at new hypotheses. So, I've talked to him about it. Let's get 20 different hypotheses and let's fund these people to, pursue those hypotheses to see if we can figure out what the different multifactorial etiologies of autism is. I agree with Kennedy and Trump on this, that this is not genetic, right? This is all, you don't go to the degree of increase that we've seen in our population based on genetics. This is environmental factors, and let's figure out what they are so we can try to minimize them. So, and it's probably not one; it's probably multiple. And I mean, and everyone jumps on them when they come out with the Tylenol. They didn't say Tylenol caused autism. So they said in the studies it was associated with. That's not causation. It was association. You could, and it wasn't just Tylenol. It was Tylenol for more than 30 days. And, the real the thing in that press release was not the Tylenol story at all. It was the leucovorin that some people really got some positive effects of better communication with leucovorin. So, I'm confident that Jay Bhattacharya and Kennedy is going to invest the money to allow scientific firepower to get in this in a serious way. And we got to get away from a single hypothesis. You got to say it's this or it's this. You know, you got to say, okay, it's vaccines, it's not vaccines. No, let's let some smart people come up with different hypotheses, put the money behind them, let them rule out their hypotheses. I always told people when I used to do a lot of science, I used to always really appreciate the people that proved my hypothesis was wrong because they taught me something. I don't really like the people as much that prove that I'm right because they didn't teach me anything. But if you prove that I'm wrong, you have really helped me out. And a lot of people look at me and say, well, how can you say that? Why would you want people to prove? Because that's what science does. Don't criticize me because I was wrong. That's what science is supposed to do. You're supposed to purify yourself, come up with an idea, and then somebody proves that you were wrong. That's a positive thing. It's not a negative thing.
Sounds a bit like it worked in reverse for you, where they decided what the communication had to be, the cause must be, and they took away your ability to communicate potential multiple hypotheses, which is the reverse scientific method. Come to the conclusion before actually asking the questions.
I told Tony, I mean, if you read the things about Fauci and Collins when they said it had to be the wet market, I said their approach was antithetical to science. Yeah, you know, they were doing it because they think they were protecting science by trying to shift the blame from the laboratory to nature. The problem was, you know, and what they did in the long run is they lost a lot of credibility, and as a consequence, they lost credibility in science.
Bill Maher is actually one of my, he's a super smart guy. I don't know if you watch the Bill Maher show ever.
Every now and then I like him because he's willing to poke fun at everybody.
He's openly, he'll pick on anybody who deserves it. So, and he did this really funny documentary called Religulous, where he actually decided to go and, talk to people who were a bit extreme in every religion. He's openly atheist. And he got to the end and he said, when it comes to religion, when it comes to things like the afterlife, I am just in that humble place of I don't know. I could admit I don't know. I don't know the answer. And I used to train young pacemaker reps, when I was back in that industry. And I used to tell them there is nothing wrong and there's everything right with saying, I don't know the answer, but I'm going to really try to find out what it is.
One of my most famous positions was to say, I don't know. When I was CDC director, I would say, if they asked me a question, I don't know. And I'll never forget Fauci telling me, you can't say that. You're the CDC director. You can't say you don't know. I said, but Tony, I don't know.
When it comes to your book, you know, there's a lot of people out there fear mongering, trying to instill states of fear. You know, I get the impression that that is not your goal here. I get the impression that you have hope that we can rebuild this system and that you'd love to just simply see it before, your life is over.
Yeah, I think you hit it right. I mean, it was catchy to say Redfield's warning because some people may misinterpret that as all negative. I'm not negative. I'm an optimist. I believe in the power of science. I believe in the power of the American people. And what I'm trying to do is make people aware of the critical steps that we need to put in place so we succeed.
I admire you for being unafraid to say, I don't know. I am part of that camp. When I don't know something, I often lecture young entrepreneurs and I say, you should endeavor incessantly to make yourself the dumbest person in the room because that means you get to learn the most. And I think I'm hoping that we're on the way there. I love that we're having conversations. I think you wrote your book at the right time when the right people were in place and the right ears were open, to make positive change. So thank you for having the guts to actually be, against the grain, for not reversing the scientific method and being unafraid to tell people that. And because you've spent 40 years trying to protect me and my family and my friends and the people around me. And it's like the concept of how could you not find somebody who's trying to make children in your family healthier, noble? So I don't know how anybody could ever look at anything you've ever done and not just call it noble. So a personal thank you and a public thank you as well.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks for the time, and stay optimistic. I have a great confidence in the power of science, and I'm very hopeful that on J. Brad Bhattacharya and Bobby Kennedy's watch, that they're going to figure out and make some major progress on autism, which I think would be a great gift to a lot of people. And you know, and we do the best we can, right? That's all we can do.
That's all we can do. You can't fault somebody for trying their hardest. Yeah. So you're a good dude. Thank you for your time.
Yeah, God bless. Bye bye.